She was 5, alone in an airport, waiting for a father who would never return, until a billionaire in a light blue suit changed her life with 3 words: "Come with me." The airport was loud, as always, rolling suitcases, murmuring voices, the distant crackle of announcements over the intercom. Somewhere near gate B14, in a chair far too large for her tiny body, sat a little girl in a pale pink dress. Her name was Lillian, though everyone who had ever loved her called her Lily. She was 5 years old, with hair the color of sunlight and eyes the shade of a summer sky. Her legs didn't quite reach the edge of the seat, and her arms were tightly wrapped around a worn-out plush bunny that had lost one of its eyes long ago. Lily didn't cry. She had done that earlier, when her father knelt beside her and told her very calmly, "Wait right here, okay? Daddy will be back soon. Don't move." He had kissed her forehead, stood up, and walked away quickly. She had watched his back grow smaller and smaller in the crowd, her heart pounding faster with every step he took. At first she believed him. She had no reason not to. But now, hours later, the ache in her stomach wasn't from hunger, it was from the growing realization that maybe he wasn't coming back. People passed her, glanced, some even slowed down, but no one stopped. Maybe they assumed she was waiting for a late flight with a nearby parent. Maybe they didn't want to interfere. Lily barely noticed them anyway. She had been counting how many times the same janitor walked past. She tried to hum a lullaby her mother used to sing, but her throat felt dry and stiff. The sleeves of her dress were getting cold, and her legs had gone numb beneath her. The chair wasn't soft, and the lights were too bright for sleeping, but exhaustion won. At some point, Lily drifted off, still clutching her bunny, her head tilted awkwardly against the armrest. She dreamt of something strange and warm, her mother's arms, a fireplace, the smell of cookies. Then the dream twisted. Her father was there, holding a suitcase. He looked at her, then turned and walked into a doorway of light, shutting it behind him. She stirred slightly, murmuring her mother's name under her breath. The intercom crackled again. "Flight to Cancun. Final boarding call." She didn't hear it. Not consciously. But her body twitched as if it did. Something inside her knew that name. And in the sea of noise and motion, no one noticed that she had been sitting alone for more than 4 hours. No one except one man, walking briskly through the terminal, glancing at his phone, on his way to a private lounge. He would have passed her completely, had he not caught something out of the corner of his eye, a small figure slumped in the seat, too still, too quiet, too alone. Something about her didn't match the rest of the airport's motion. It made him stop. But Lily didn't see him yet. She was still half asleep, her fingers tangled in the fabric of her dress, her bunny slipping just slightly to the floor. He stood still for a moment, letting the crowd flow around him like a river parting at a rock. His name was Nicholas Morgan, and though few travelers recognized him in passing, his name was known throughout the aviation world. CEO of Skirich Airlines, founder of 3 other major companies before the age of 40, and one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country, Nicholas was not the kind of man who stopped in busy terminals for anything or anyone. His schedule was measured in seconds, not minutes. He wore a suit that looked effortless but cost more than most people's cars, a soft light blue tailored precisely to his lean frame. His shoes shone but not ostentatiously. His black hair was combed back with the kind of care that suggested both discipline and habit, not vanity. His phone buzzed quietly in his hand, a text from a board member blinking on the screen, but he didn't look at it. What had caught his eye wasn't something he could explain right away. At first, it was just a shape, small, slumped, barely moving, alone. A child left in the middle of chaos. That alone would have been strange enough to warrant a second look. But it wasn't just her size or stillness that pulled him in. It was something about the posture, the way her body curled around the stuffed rabbit, the tension in her little hands even in sleep. There was grief in that shape. Not just loneliness. Not just waiting. Something deeper. Something painfully familiar. Nicholas turned slightly and took a few steps toward her, cautious not to startle her. Up close, he saw her more clearly. The pale pink dress had a frayed hem, as if it had been worn too often and washed too little. Her shoes didn't match. One was white and new, the other scuffed and too small. Her blonde hair was tangled, as though it hadn't seen a brush in days. And her face, he wasn't sure how to describe it, looked both older and younger than it should have. There was innocence, yes, but it was hidden beneath a mask of practiced stillness, the kind he recognized because once, long ago, it had been his own. He crouched down slowly in front of her. She didn't wake. The bunny's head had slipped and was now dangling off the edge of the seat by one limp ear. He picked it up gently and placed it back into her arms. Her fingers closed around it automatically, but she didn't open her eyes. "Excuse me," he said softly, unsure if he wanted to wake her or just make sure she was breathing. She stirred at the sound of his voice, her head tilting slightly as she blinked herself back into the too bright lights of reality. Her eyes were the exact color of his own, icy blue with flecks of silver near the center. But where his were sharp and calculating, hers were clouded with fear and confusion. She sat up a little and rubbed her face. "Daddy?" she asked, voice cracking from dryness and sleep. Nicholas felt something twist in his chest. "No," he said gently. "I'm not your daddy. But, are you okay? Are you waiting for someone?" She nodded slowly at first, as if trying to remember the script. "He told me to stay here," she said. "He said he'd come back. But he's taking a long time." Nicholas didn't answer right away. He glanced around. No adults nearby looked concerned. No one was watching her from afar. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to Carter, his right-hand man, "Find out if there are any reports of a missing child at LAX. Gate B14. 5-year-old girl. Get security. Quietly." He turned back to her and offered the smallest smile he could manage. "How long have you been waiting?" She looked at the giant digital clock above the gate and frowned. "Since the sun was in the glass. Now it's gone." Nicholas followed her gaze and understood. She meant morning light. It was well past 3 in the afternoon now. He sat on the floor beside her, ignoring the strange looks from passing travelers. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily," she whispered. "But Mommy called me Lillian when she was mad." He nodded. "Nice to meet you, Lily. I'm Nicholas." She tilted her head slightly. "You have shiny shoes." He chuckled softly. "Yes, I suppose I do." A uniformed airport staff member approached quietly, escorted by Carter, who was already tapping something into his tablet. The man whispered into Nicholas's ear, careful not to alarm the child. Cameras show she was dropped off at 9:18 a.m. Man left through the main terminal. Boarded a flight to Mexico. No return ticket. No luggage. Nicholas closed his eyes for a second. A dull, familiar anger rose in him, not loud and burning, but cold, the kind that stayed. He looked at Lily again, at the way she sat straight now, pretending to be fine. "Lily," he said, voice firm but calm, "do you know your daddy's phone number?" She shook her head. "Do you know where he went?" She paused. "He said, he was going to get something to eat. But he didn't come back. Nicholas looked at Carter, who gave the slightest shake of his head. "We've got nothing in the system. No reports filed. No attempt to return. It's a drop." He nodded once. Then he turned back to the girl and reached out his hand, not with command but with quiet steadiness. "Would it be all right," he asked, "if I stayed with you until we figure this out?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at his face for a long time. Maybe searching for signs of danger. Maybe looking for a lie. But she saw something else, something tired, yes, but kind. Slowly, she placed her small hand into his. It was warm and trembling. And in that moment, Nicholas Morgan, a man who had spent his life building empires in the sky, felt his entire world shift closer to Earth. By the time they left the terminal, the sun had dipped low, casting long amber beams across the polished floors of the airport. Nicholas carried Lily in his arms, her small body pressed close against his chest, her head resting quietly beneath his chin. She had stopped asking questions. Her voice had gone quiet again, as though she had already run out of words. Her fingers clutched the bunny like a lifeline, and Nicholas noticed that even in sleep, or whatever state she hovered in, her grip never loosened. Outside, a sleek black car waited near the private executive exit. Carter stood nearby, holding the door open, eyes sharp, jaw tight. As Nicholas slid into the back seat with Lily in his lap, Carter entered on the opposite side and shut the door behind them. The car began to move smoothly into the Los Angeles traffic. "She's not in the system," Carter began, opening the file on his tablet with a swipe. "No missing persons report. No Amber Alert. Nothing flagged by the authorities. It's like she doesn't officially exist right now." He paused, then added with a grim expression, "We found her birth certificate, though. Name is Lillian May Hale. Born in Santa Rosa. Mother, Mary Elizabeth Hale. Father, James Hale. No other legal guardians on file. No CPS history. Nothing." Nicholas looked down at the girl sleeping in his arms. "And the mother?" "Dead," Carter replied quietly. 2 months ago. Breast cancer. According to the records, she'd been sick for years, in and out of hospitals. Single-income household. James Hale was a construction worker, though he hasn't held a stable job in almost a year. There are debts all over, medical, credit cards, unpaid rent. He was evicted from their last apartment 3 weeks ago. Nicholas exhaled slowly, watching the city blur past the window. He didn't speak for a moment. When he finally did, his voice was soft but hollowed out. "So he took her to the airport, left her there like baggage." Carter nodded. "Boarded a 10:30 a.m. flight to Cancun. One way. No checked luggage. Bought the ticket in cash 2 hours before departure. Cameras show him watching her for a while from across the terminal before disappearing. And he didn't even leave a note," Nicholas muttered, almost to himself. "No. Nothing. Just walked away." Nicholas looked out the window again, his hand gently brushing Lily's tangled hair back from her forehead. Something about her face struck him, not just its beauty or fragility, but the familiarity of it. That stoic silence she wore wasn't natural. It had been learned. It was armor. A child shouldn't have to learn how to disappear to stay safe. He remembered wearing the same kind of mask when he was her age, sitting in the cold lobby of the orphanage after his parents had dropped him off with a garbage bag of his clothes and the words, "You'll be better off here." He closed his eyes and let that memory pass through him like a wave. Then he turned back to Carter. Find out if she has any living relatives. Aunts. Uncles. Anyone. Carter tapped rapidly on his screen, already scanning new databases. So far, nothing immediate. Mary was an only child. Parents deceased. No siblings listed for James either, but I'm still checking. Nicholas shook his head slowly. Even if we find someone, I'm not handing her over to a stranger just because of shared blood. She's not your responsibility, Carter said carefully, not challenging but reminding. You did what most people wouldn't. You made sure she was safe. Authorities can handle the rest. We could get her into temporary foster care tonight. She'll be protected. Nicholas's jaw tightened. He looked down at Lily again. Her cheek was pressed against his chest now, and she let out a tiny sigh in her sleep, the kind that almost sounded like a question. It shook him more than he expected. I'm not letting her sleep in some cold bed surrounded by more strangers, he said quietly. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Carter blinked, caught off guard. You're serious. She doesn't need bureaucracy, Nicholas continued, as if to himself. She needs someone to stay. Someone who won't disappear in a crowd. Someone who doesn't promise things they never plan to deliver. And you think that someone is you? Nicholas didn't answer at first. The silence stretched long. Then he finally said, I don't know what I think. But I know I couldn't walk away. Not from her. They rode the rest of the way in near silence, the weight of the decision already beginning to sink into Nicholas's bones. He had board meetings waiting, a private jet scheduled to take him to Zurich the next morning, an empire to run. Every part of his life had been built on control, precision, and distance. But now, in the crook of his arm, was a sleeping girl with a broken past and a future as uncertain as a flight path in a storm. She had no voice to advocate for herself. No parent who wanted her. No idea that the man who held her now had more power than most governments. All she had, at that moment, was him. And that, for Nicholas Morgan, was more than enough. The mansion in Malibu stood like a modern fortress on the edge of the world, its sleek glass walls reflecting the Pacific Ocean in fractured, endless blues. It was a place built for silence, for seclusion, for those who could afford to keep the noise of life at a safe distance. Every corner of the house was designed with purpose, clean lines, controlled light, expensive art that matched the mood of each room. But despite the warmth of its materials, it felt cold that first night Lily arrived. Not because of its temperature or decor, but because a house without laughter, without footsteps, without childhood, is not a home at all. Nicholas carried her in, still asleep, through the foyer with its polished black floors and towering ceilings. A housekeeper emerged, startled by the sight of a child in his arms, but he held up one hand and said only, "Prepare one of the guest bedrooms. Small bed. Warm lighting. She stays here." The staff didn't ask questions. They were used to his abrupt changes in tone, his rare but decisive deviations from routine. Yet even for them, this was different. A girl. A child. In Nicholas Morgan's world, there had never been space for that. He brought her upstairs himself, bypassing the main guest wing and instead choosing a smaller room near his own. It had once been a reading room, but it was quiet and tucked away, and in that moment, it felt right. He laid her down gently on the plush daybed and pulled a cashmere throw over her small body. She didn't stir, only curled slightly into the blanket as though trying to make herself smaller. When he turned off the overhead light and left a dim lamp glowing in the corner, he stood there for a long while, just watching her. Something in him felt unfamiliar, a sensation he hadn't allowed himself in years. Not pity. Not sympathy. Something more dangerous, connection. The next morning, Lily woke up without knowing where she was. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply sat up slowly, clutching her bunny, and stared at the room around her. Her eyes scanned every detail, the large window, the soft gray curtains, the framed photograph of a mountain range, the tall bookshelf with rows of unread volumes. Her body remained perfectly still, but her mind was racing. She had trained herself, instinctively, to observe before acting. She waited to see what this new place wanted from her. Nicholas found her like that, wide-eyed and mute, sitting on the edge of the bed as though ready to run. He approached cautiously, coffee cup in one hand, a tray in the other. On it were scrambled eggs, toast, a cup of warm milk, and a banana sliced into uneven circles. He had asked the chef to make something simple, childlike, but without assuming too much. "Good morning," he said gently, setting the tray down on the bedside table. She didn't respond. He sat in the nearby armchair, far enough to give her space. "You're safe," he said after a pause. "No one here will hurt you. You can eat when you're ready. You can sleep longer if you want. You don't have to talk." Still nothing. But her eyes flicked to the tray and then back to him. She was calculating. Assessing the situation. He recognized it because he'd done the same thing at her age, evaluating strangers for signs of cruelty, reading their tone, their body language, the movements of their hands. It wasn't normal behavior for a child, but nothing about Lily's life had been normal. For the rest of the day, she remained quiet. She walked the hallways with bare feet, keeping close to the walls. She didn't speak to the housekeeper who offered her a warm towel or to the cook who waved from the kitchen. She explored silently, always returning to the same room, as if afraid it would disappear the moment she stepped too far away. Nicholas cancelled his Zurich trip. He told Carter to reschedule every meeting that couldn't be delegated. He didn't explain why. Carter didn't ask. On the third day, Lily spoke. It was a whisper, barely a sound, as Nicholas sat on the floor of the living room reading the financial reports he had printed out. She was sitting across from him on the carpet, her bunny perched beside her. She had been drawing with a set of colored pencils one of the staff had laid out without instruction. The first 2 days, all her drawings were black scribbles, shapes of storms and tangled shadows. But now she had drawn something else, 3 figures. 2 tall, 1 small, all holding hands beneath a sky that was no longer just black. "That's Mommy," she said, pointing at the figure in the red dress. "That's me." Her finger moved to the little girl with the yellow hair. Then she pointed to the last figure, taller than the others, in a blue suit. "That's you." Nicholas didn't know what to say. He looked at the drawing, then at her. She didn't smile, but her voice no longer trembled. It was the closest thing to trust he had seen from her yet. Each day after that, something changed. She began eating at the table instead of on the bed. She sat beside him when he read, occasionally pointing at a word and asking what it meant. She began brushing her own hair. She asked for a toothbrush with the color purple on it. She still didn't laugh. Not yet. But she began humming to herself when she thought no one was listening. Soft melodies, fragments of songs that had probably lived in her mother's voice. At night, Nicholas would hear the soft padding of her feet crossing the hallway. She never knocked. She would simply stand in his doorway, eyes wide and uncertain. He never sent her back. He would lift the blanket and let her curl up on the chaise near his bed, the bunny always nestled against her chest. She didn't want to be alone in the dark. He understood that too well. The silence between them was never empty. It was filled with learning each other's patterns, testing the boundaries of safety, discovering that some promises, when spoken carefully, could be real. Lily had been abandoned, yes. But now, for reasons Nicholas didn't entirely understand, she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time, someone had stayed. The legal letter arrived 2 months after Lily had begun smiling again. It came in a plain white envelope, unmarked on the outside, hand-delivered by a courier who seemed unaware of the weight he carried. Nicholas had just finished a video call with the European Board of Steerage when the envelope was placed on his desk. He opened it casually, not expecting anything important, until he saw the name at the top of the attached petition, James Hale. The man who had walked away from his own daughter in an airport terminal, who had boarded a flight to Mexico and never looked back, was now petitioning the court for custody. Nicholas stared at the pages in silence for several minutes. He didn't move. He didn't speak. On paper, James claimed to be a changed man, reformed, regretful, stable. The petition described a new job, clean living conditions, counseling sessions attended regularly. It included statements from supposed character witnesses, none of whom were familiar to Nicholas. The legal language was careful and manipulative, framed just well enough to stir the interest of a judge. But Nicholas didn't need to read between the lines to understand the truth. This wasn't about love or redemption. This was about control, about reclaiming something lost not out of guilt, but out of ego. He stood up and walked to the window, the papers clenched in his hand. Outside, Lily was in the garden, chasing butterflies with a net that was too large for her. She wore a straw hat, one that the housekeeper had adjusted with purple ribbon at her request. The sun lit up her golden hair, and she laughed, really laughed, from the belly, the kind of sound that had once felt like a miracle in these halls. She didn't know about court systems, about biological rights, about how fragile her new life still was beneath all the calm. Nicholas took a deep breath, then buzzed Carter. "We need a family law attorney. The best. Discreet but relentless." Carter didn't ask questions. He never did. Within 48 hours, a team was assembled, legal counsel, child advocacy specialists, and a private investigator tasked with reviewing James Hale's so-called redemption story. The process moved fast. James had filed in the county where Lily was born, forcing Nicholas to temporarily shift operations to Northern California to be closer to the jurisdiction. He rented a small estate outside Santa Rosa and set up a mobile command office while Lily continued her tutoring and piano lessons, unaware of the storm gathering outside her quiet world. When the day of the hearing came, Nicholas found himself sitting on a cold wooden bench in a modest courthouse that smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. He wore a dark tailored suit, not his usual light blue. He wanted to project gravity, not flash. Lily remained at home with a guardian and therapist, kept far from the proceedings for her own protection. She still didn't know that the man who had abandoned her now wanted to take her away. James Hale entered the courtroom with forced humility, cheap shoes, a pressed shirt slightly too large, a fresh haircut that didn't quite hide the damage beneath. Nicholas watched him, observed the false sorrow in his eyes, the way he glanced around to see who was watching. He didn't seem interested in Lily. He seemed interested in winning. The courtroom filled with low murmurs as arguments began. James's attorney framed the story with careful pity, a grieving father, broken by loss, momentarily overwhelmed but now reformed. They emphasized his efforts to build a new life, his rights as the biological parent, the injustice of a billionaire playing hero. When Nicholas's counsel responded, they did so with surgical precision. They presented video evidence of James abandoning Lily at the airport, walking away without hesitation. They shared financial records showing cash withdrawals consistent with gambling, not stability. They presented statements from child psychologists, therapists, and caretakers, each one speaking not only to Lily's improved well-being under Nicholas's guardianship, but also to the severe trauma she had endured as a direct result of her father's neglect. And then, unexpectedly, Nicholas stood up and requested to address the court himself. It wasn't part of the plan, but he couldn't stay silent. He walked to the front with slow, steady steps, paused for a moment, and then began. "I've spent my life building things, companies, systems, structures so efficient they run without me. I thought that meant success. I thought control meant safety. And then, one day, I saw a little girl asleep in an airport chair, clinging to a stuffed rabbit with more trust than most people show to each other. She had been left behind by someone who was supposed to protect her. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just waited." He glanced down at the judge, then back at the courtroom. "Your Honor, I'm not here to replace anyone. I didn't ask for this responsibility, but once it was in front of me, I made a decision. Not a temporary one. Not a generous gesture. A permanent, life-altering commitment. I gave Lily the one thing she had been denied her whole life, consistency. And I won't let anyone take that from her. Especially not someone who ran when it mattered most." Silence followed his words. Even James didn't speak. For the first time, the courtroom was quiet, not out of order, but out of respect. The judge took 2 days to issue the decision. They were the longest 2 days Nicholas had ever lived. Lily sensed something, grew quieter, clung to him more in the evenings, asked if they were going to move again. He lied gently, told her no matter what happened, they'd figure it out together. And when the ruling came, when the judge declared that sole custody would remain with Nicholas Morgan, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a fragile exhale, a rescue pulled off at the very edge of the cliff. He didn't tell Lily the details. He just held her when she came running in from the yard and whispered in her ear, "You're staying home." She pulled back and looked up at him with wide eyes. "Really?" He nodded. "Forever. As long as you want." And for the first time, she wrapped her arms around his neck and said the word he hadn't expected, hadn't dared to hope for. "Okay, Daddy." Autumn arrived quietly that year, dressing the hills of Malibu in soft golds and muted reds. The ocean still shimmered under the afternoon sun, but the air had taken on a coolness that made morning walks feel fresh and new. In the Morgan estate, something deeper than the seasons was changing, something slow and meaningful, like the way old wounds begin to close when they've finally been treated with care. Lily was growing, not just in inches, but in presence. Her eyes, once wide with caution, now sparkled with curiosity. She asked questions, about everything. About the moon and how it glowed without fire. About birds and why they didn't fall from the sky. About Nicholas and what he was like when he was her age. She was especially fond of asking that one, as though some part of her knew the answer mattered more than he let on. She had taken to the piano almost by accident. One evening, after dinner, Nicholas had walked past the rarely used music room to find her standing on her toes, peeking over the edge of the grand piano's polished surface. He opened the lid for her and showed her where to place her hands. She pressed one key and giggled at the sound. He sat beside her and showed her another. The giggle turned into concentration. Something had clicked. A week later, he hired a music teacher, not one of those rigid, performance-obsessed instructors, but a woman named Clara who had taught music therapy to children in pediatric hospitals. Clara arrived with laughter in her voice and patience in her hands. She never corrected Lily harshly. Instead, she encouraged her to feel the music before trying to perfect it. She let her play with mistakes, with uneven rhythm, with heart. Lily blossomed. By midwinter, she was playing melodies recognizable enough that even the staff stopped to listen when she practiced. She favored lullabies, minor chords, haunting sounds that often made Nicholas stop in the hallway and listen from just beyond the door. He never interrupted. He just stood there, letting her music fill the parts of the house that had been silent for too long. One evening, Clara arrived with sheet music and a gentle challenge, a beginner's arrangement of Debussy's Clair de Lune. Lily's eyes widened at the page, overwhelmed at first. But within a week, she could play the first few measures from memory. Clara was stunned, but Nicholas wasn't. He had already seen it, that quiet fire in Lily, the one that burned beneath all her softness. She didn't play for applause. She played because something inside her needed to speak in a language that words couldn't touch. Nicholas began spending more time at home. Meetings were taken via video calls. His travel schedule became increasingly rare. Shareholders questioned it, board members pushed back, but he made it clear, his priorities had changed. And they had. Entirely. The man who once measured life in quarterly returns and global acquisitions now measured it in music lessons, bedtime stories, and the sound of a little girl laughing just outside his office door. Then, one Saturday afternoon in early spring, Lily had her first public recital. It was a small charity event, held in a modest hall in Santa Monica, attended by families and friends of the music school. Nicholas had insisted it remain low profile. No cameras. No press. Just a room filled with strangers who could hear what Lily had found in herself. She wore a pale blue dress, soft tulle at the hem, and her hair was tied back with a simple ribbon. Nicholas sat in the front row, unusually nervous, though he knew she was ready. Clara squeezed his arm before the performance and whispered, "She's not afraid. You don't need to be either." When Lily walked onto the stage, her eyes scanned the room only until they found him. She smiled, small, but real, and sat at the piano. The room fell silent. She played. Her fingers trembled slightly in the first bars, but she found the rhythm quickly. And then something incredible happened. The music took her. It moved through her not like something rehearsed, but like something remembered. It poured out of her hands like light through stained glass, fragile, imperfect, beautiful. When the last note faded, the silence that followed felt like reverence. Then the applause came. Soft at first, then stronger. But Lily didn't react to it. She stood up, bowed politely, and walked off stage as if none of it mattered. She wasn't playing for them. She had been playing for someone else. Backstage, a woman approached them, graying hair, nurse's scrubs, eyes red from emotion. She looked at Nicholas, then at Lily. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "You don't know me. I was Mary Hale's nurse. Your mother. I looked after her during her last weeks." Lily stepped closer, cautious but curious. "Your mother used to talk about you," the woman continued, kneeling to Lily's level. "Even when she was in pain. She said you would be extraordinary. That one day, someone would see who you really were." Lily looked down, unsure what to say. Nicholas rested a hand on her shoulder. The nurse smiled through her tears. "She would have loved this. She would have cried, just like I did." That night, Nicholas and Lily drove home in silence, the kind of silence that feels like music still echoing in the air. She held his hand the entire ride. When they reached the house, she didn't go to her room. Instead, she followed him into the study and sat in his lap, curling into his chest. "You think Mommy heard it?" she whispered. Nicholas closed his eyes, holding her tighter. I think she never stopped listening. The seventh birthday came quietly, without grand spectacle or fanfare, just as Lily had asked. Nicholas had offered to throw a celebration, something simple, he'd said, but elegant, a garden party perhaps, with a few of her piano classmates, balloons, a custom cake, even a magician if she wanted one. But Lily had shaken her head softly and said, I don't want a party. I just want a day with you. And so that was exactly what he gave her. The morning began with breakfast in the sunroom, the glass walls opening wide to let in the ocean breeze. The table had been set with her favorite things, cinnamon rolls, strawberries dusted with powdered sugar, and a small porcelain teacup filled with warm milk and honey. Her eyes lit up when she saw that the cinnamon rolls had been shaped like little roses, a detail Nicholas had insisted on, though he'd never admit how much time he'd spent describing it to the chef. Lily wore a simple white cotton dress with tiny embroidered flowers around the collar. Her hair, now longer and more golden than ever, was pulled back into a loose braid. She looked older somehow, not just in appearance, but in the way she carried herself, like someone who had already seen too much of the world and chosen to meet it with quiet grace rather than defiance. They spent the day just the two of them. First, they walked along the beach near the estate, barefoot in the cool sand, her hand tightly gripping his. She told him stories about imaginary sea creatures who lived under the waves, creatures she'd created, each with names and voices and favorite colors. Nicholas listened attentively, even responding to them when she paused to let him speak. He didn't care how strange they were. He was simply in awe of how her mind worked, how much imagination she still carried despite everything she had lived through. Later, back at the house, they spent hours in the library, not reading, but drawing. Nicholas, who had not picked up a pencil for anything other than signing contracts in over a decade, was surprised to find how much joy there was in sketching alongside her. She drew whimsical versions of them both, he with exaggerated tallness and a blue tie that stretched off the paper, and her with giant round eyes and a sparkly crown. I know I'm not a princess, she said with a shrug. But sometimes it feels good to pretend. In the afternoon, Nicholas led her upstairs to one of the guest rooms that had been mysteriously locked for weeks. When he opened the door, Lily gasped. It was no longer a guest room. It had been transformed into a music room just for her. The walls were soft lilac, her favorite color. A new upright piano stood in the corner, surrounded by shelves of music books and a small desk covered in blank composition paper. There was even a cushioned window seat with throw pillows and a view that overlooked the sea. For your songs, Nicholas said simply. She stepped inside slowly, almost afraid to touch anything. Her hand brushed across the piano's keys, and she turned to look at him with wide, stunned eyes. This is all for me. He nodded. I don't have to share it. Not unless you want to. She didn't speak for a long time. She simply walked across the room, sat on the piano bench, and began to play something soft and slow, something that hadn't existed until that very moment. That evening, after dinner, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon and the sky turned a deep indigo, Nicholas sat in the living room, flipping through the day's news on his tablet. Lily came in without saying a word and curled up beside him on the couch, wrapping her arms around one of his. She was quiet for a while, her head resting against his shoulder, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Then, without turning to look at him, she asked, "Can I ask for one more birthday present?" "Anything," Nicholas said immediately, already bracing for some obscure and possibly unachievable request. But her next words stopped him cold. "Can I call you Daddy now?" He looked down at her, his throat tightening so quickly he had to swallow hard before answering. Her eyes were full of cautious hope, like she was offering him the most fragile part of herself and waiting to see if he would hold it carefully or let it fall. You can call me whatever feels right to you, he said finally, his voice low, strained, and softer than he expected. Okay, she said, and tucked herself closer against his side. Daddy, thank you. He didn't reply. He couldn't. Instead, he held her close and pressed his lips to the top of her head, letting the weight of that one word settle into his chest like the final piece of a long-missing puzzle. It wasn't a contract or a court ruling. It wasn't notarized or filed away in legal documents. But in that moment, with a single word, she had chosen him. Not because she had to. Not because anyone told her to. But because, in her heart, she already knew what he had known for some time now, that he wasn't just her guardian. He was her father. 10 years passed, and the echoes of that first quiet birthday never left Nicholas's memory. They returned to him in fragments, sometimes in the scent of cinnamon in the kitchen, sometimes in the sound of footsteps padding down the hallway in the early morning hours. But the little girl who once curled beside him on the couch, unsure if she was allowed to ask for love, had transformed into something extraordinary, precisely as her mother had once predicted. Lily was now 15. Her music had matured into something beyond her age, both technically and emotionally. She no longer played to escape, she played to express, to communicate things she hadn't learned how to say out loud. Her pieces carried weight, even when they were soft, and her compositions, entirely her own by now, often left people breathless. She was no longer just a talented child. She was an artist, with critics whispering that she might be one of the finest pianists of her generation. Nicholas had watched every step of her evolution with a kind of reverence he couldn't explain. He had seen her struggle through self-doubt, push through the immense pressure of being noticed too young, and still somehow remain grounded. She had grown into a young woman with quiet confidence, sharp wit, and a soft heart that never forgot what it meant to be alone. She volunteered at shelters on weekends, gave music lessons to children who couldn't afford them, and never once asked for attention in return. Then came Vienna. The invitation had arrived on crisp ivory paper, embossed with gold lettering and sent directly from the competition board, the Grand Prix for young pianists, one of the most prestigious events in the classical music world. No one under 18 had ever won it. Few under 20 had even made it to the finals. Lily had been accepted to perform as a finalist. Nicholas had read the letter twice, then again, before realizing it was real. Clara cried when she heard. Even Carter, who rarely reacted to anything with emotion, had paused in stunned admiration. Lily approached it with the same grace she brought to everything else in her life. She didn't gloat. She didn't spiral into fear. She practiced diligently but without obsession. She told Nicholas one night, over tea, that it wasn't about winning. "It's about proving to myself that I belong in the room," she had said. "That I earned my place with my own voice, not because someone gave it to me out of sympathy." Vienna was cold in early December, a city steeped in history and shadows of genius. The concert hall itself was a marvel, marble floors, towering ceilings, and chandeliers that seemed to whisper stories from centuries past. On the night of the final performance, Nicholas sat in the audience, silent and still, his hands folded in his lap, his heart louder than the quiet crowd around him. Lily walked onto the stage with poise far beyond her years. Her gown was simple, dark velvet with delicate embroidery along the sleeves, and her hair was tied in a low bun. She looked nothing like the frightened child he had once found asleep in an airport chair. She looked like someone who knew exactly who she was. She bowed, sat at the grand piano, took one steady breath, and began. The music that followed was unlike anything Nicholas had ever heard, not just from her, but from anyone. It was haunting and radiant at once, as though she had poured every memory, every ghost of her past, into the notes. There were hints of sorrow, deep wells of grief, but also moments of sheer joy and resilience that lifted the room to someplace higher. It wasn't just a performance. It was a story, one only she could tell, and everyone who listened felt the weight of it. When it ended, the silence in the hall lasted longer than the applause that eventually erupted. It was the kind of silence that only comes when something sacred has just taken place. Nicholas didn't clap right away. He couldn't. His hands had gone numb. His vision was blurred. All he could do was stare at her, at this girl, no, this woman, who had once reached for his hand with trembling fingers and now stood on the stage of Europe's most revered hall, commanding it like she was born for it. She won. The youngest winner in the competition's history. The judges were unanimous in their decision. Her name was printed on programs, spoken on radios, shared across social media platforms. Articles were written. Interviews requested. Offers from major conservatories arrived within days. But what Nicholas remembered most wasn't the trophy or the headlines. It was what she said in her post-performance interview. Standing before the press, dressed simply and without makeup, she answered questions with composure. Until one journalist, a man in his 50s with a curious gleam in his eye, asked her, "Lily, what would you say to your biological father if he were watching this now?" The room hushed. Cameras tilted. The air seemed to freeze. Lily didn't flinch. She met the question without blinking, without anger, and simply said, "I'd tell him I forgive him. But I wouldn't hug him. I already have a real father." The statement rippled through the room like an electric wave. But Nicholas, standing just off stage, didn't hear the reaction. He didn't need to. He had already begun to cry. Later that night, back at their hotel, she knocked gently on his door. He opened it, and there she was, in her pajamas, bare feet on the carpet, the trophy clutched under one arm. She looked up at him, sheepish and glowing. "I think we did okay, huh?" she said with a grin. Nicholas reached out, pulled her into his arms, and held her tightly. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking, "we did better than okay." In the quiet that followed, she leaned her head against his chest, just as she used to, and said softly, "Thank you for staying. Thank you for never letting go." He kissed her forehead and whispered back, "Thank you for giving me something I never knew I needed." In the heart of Vienna, in a hotel far from the cold halls of an airport a decade ago, a family built not by blood but by love sat quietly, knowing that they had already won the only prize that ever truly mattered.